Thanks very much to the International Council of Psychologists for inviting us here, myself and my colleague Richard Plenty, to speak at your 79th annual conference on promoting equity and justice in an age of uncertainty. Our talk is on living and working with uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that we've been certainly dealing with over the last couple of years. With our book we brought out 2 years ago on uncertainty rules. A lot of our talk is based on this. We also wrote a chapter on Brexit in the workplace, a chapter on uncertainty, which we'll just refer to in the talk. We co-facilitated the Global Psychology Alliance of Psychological Associations at the first summit in Lisbon in November 2019. We've been involved in that ever since. My colleague Richard's on the APA Climate Task Force, and I am on a project, a European project, as the Chair of Innovation at the High Level Advisory Board on a Green Roots project, which looks at the green and blue environment and its impact on people's well-being. We also lecture in risk and systems change in Trinity College Dublin, and we write a column for People Matter. So that's just a little bit about ourselves. The agenda for our talk today is to, I suppose, break it up into 4 areas. We want to first of all look at the impact of uncertainty on people. Then we talk about some psychological strategies for dealing with uncertainty. A model that we've developed, which the book is based on, is the Richmor Model, and that's looking at a proactive way to approaching uncertainty and making uncertainty work for you rather than being the victim of it. And then finally taking the last section to look at some of the implications for living and working with uncertainty, and maybe drawing some implications out for the topic of the theme of this conference. So I'd like to just for you to look at this picture for a minute and see just what your experience is. As you can see, there are emerging patterns. What started out as a load of black dots, so then gradually a picture started to emerge. It was very ambiguous at the beginning, and it's only now looking back you can see with hindsight that this is the picture. However, if this went on much longer, it might actually morph into something else. We don't know. This is just a snapshot of this particular picture. Now, in uncertainty, it's very hard to plan ahead. And in that, there's lots of risk involved in uncertainty. And for some people, this can lead to anxiety, and we'll say a little bit about that later on in our talk. Now, we believe that the world has become a much more uncertain place. And I think even the theme of this conference is acknowledging that uncertainty is something that we are living with right now, and maybe indeed living with going right into the future. But before we go into looking at this world, what about the past? Well, in the past, we had what we call a LAMU, L-A-M-U world, where the world was more linear. So things were much more, straightforward, and, we could plan ahead. Things were more anthropocentric. So, we found ourselves at the center of the universe. It was much more mechanistic, as you can see here in some of these pictures of what the workforce looked like and what schooling looked like, and was much more organized. But now we're looking at what people have more recently called a VUCA world, which is, VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So we're living in a very volatile and complex environment where there are far more questions than there are answers. And when we have, so let's look at this from a logical perspective initially before we go into the psychological strategies. When we look at uncertainty from a logical perspective, when we look at the systems approach to complexity, we can see that systems can go from simple systems right up to chaotic systems. And as we go up that, I suppose, those steps of complexity, we also increase uncertainty. So the first one is a simple system. So a simple system is where there's a very clear, straightforward relationship between cause and effect. So I take an example. So let's take a microwave meal. You get your microwave meal, you look at your instructions, you follow the instructions, you put it in the oven, and in a minute or two, out comes a ready cooked meal ready to eat. Now, this is a very simple system. It's not very complicated. It's not, and it's reasonably certain, because you know when you do A, you'll get B. So the relationship between cause and effect is fairly clear, fairly straightforward. However, if we go into a complicated system, this is where we're moving up. It's becoming a little bit more uncertain. There's still a relationship between cause and effect, but it's not as clear-cut as in a simple system. So I give you an example of that is if I go to my doctor, my GP, and I go with a certain set of symptoms. I may have a temperature, I may have, a watery eyes or a runny nose. Now, prior to COVID, she would have said to me, that's most likely to be a cold. Now it's a little bit more complicated than that. It could be I could have COVID, so I maybe need to get a test. But the relationship between these symptoms and the impact on me, it's easier to find. It's easier to find a cause for this. And this is a world where experts excel. We need experts in this world, the world of people who understand, what's happening in the human body, so they can give me an idea of what might be going on for me. In a complex system, there is still a relationship between cause and effect, but it's not as clear-cut as in the previous two systems. So there may be a lot of interdependent variables or multivariate variables that are all impacting on each other. And I can't really see a clear line between something happening and the effect it's having. And that's where we need to bring different lenses or different perspectives to bear on a similar issue. So something like climate change, for example, initially people didn't think that, the various things that human beings were doing was having this effect. But now we have more evidence to suggest that is the case. But that's come about through a combination of interaction and dialogue, and people bringing different perspectives and rationales to this impact. And so we can see that a complex system may only be apparent in retrospect, like our picture. And unfortunately, like climate change at the moment, it may be that only late in the day we can see the relationship between these various variables and the impact they're having. And finally, we come to a chaotic system, and that's where just everything is just up in the air. We don't have a clue what's going on. We can't figure out what's happening. And in this kind of environment of uncertainty, there's two possible, well, there's probably more, but there's two clear-cut kind of ways you can deal with it. One is to bring in the heavy hand of autocracy and say, chaos is reigning, so I'll reign in chaos. So I know what's right, so I'll impose my will. Or it might be a world of spirituality where you let go and you just go with the flow. But that's chaotic. So in our chapter in our book on, uncertainty means certain dilemmas. And these can mean hard choices. So we don't talk about problems, we talk about dilemmas. So we have a dilemma of should we act or should we wait? If we act now, is it too soon? We don't have enough information. Or if we wait too long for the information, we may miss an opportunity. So that's one dilemma. Another dilemma is, should we plan ahead or should we just muddle our way through? Should we improvise? And as I said earlier on, planning can be difficult in a time of uncertainty. Another dilemma is, where should I get my evidence from? Should I look to the past? But then, of course, the future may be totally different from the past. Should I look at what's happening right now to predict the future? So again, hard to make choices in that kind of situation. Another dilemma is, should I try and apply a rational, logical approach to something, or should I follow my gut? And a lot of people just follow their gut. But again, we might be making the wrong decision, but we don't know in advance. We don't know until we hit the outcome. And again, another dilemma is, should I persist in what I'm doing now, or should I cut my losses and change course, take a different strategy? And the final one then is, in a time of uncertainty, whose rights matter? Is it my rights or our rights? Which maybe is the topic of this seminar and this conference. Is, whose rights should prevail here? I may talk about my rights, but my rights might be infringing our rights. And in that situation, I may have to take a picture of the greater good rather than just my rights. I mean, we're seeing this playing out right now with things like COVID, saying, I'm not going to wear a mask because my rights are being infringed. But actually, if I don't wear a mask, I may be infringing on our rights and your rights, because I could be a source of infection for a load of other people. So, you know, these are things that we have to work through, and there's no simple answer here. So these are questions we pose rather than give answers at this point in time. But uncertainty can bring an emotional toll, and we saw this with Brexit. In the UK in 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. This caused a huge, immense turmoil in the population. And I think unheard of in recent times, with people taking sides and the polarization that comes from this kind of right or wrong answer, yes or no dilemma choice that people have to make. But what we saw as a consequence of that was a rise in people using antidepressants, 13%. In the year after Brexit, which is 2017. Also in the year after, we saw an increase in sleep disorders. 10% more people reported disturbances of sleep. 20% talked about family conflicts and anxiety. 45% talked about feeling powerless and helpless and not being able to control what happened. And 39% were angry at the outcome and felt very angry. And people are still, 5 years later, still talking about this Brexit issue. We're seeing it play out at the moment with fuel crises and people panic buying and causing all sorts of more emotional distress on people at a time of uncertainty, as well as being bored and all the other emotions that come with uncertainty. Richard, I'll hand over to you to talk a little bit more about the impacts of uncertainty.
Okay, Terry, thank you. So it's hardly surprising that uncertainty can make people defensive. And particularly when you look at it in the context of all the changes that are taking place in the world, the geopolitical shifts of power, the issues with COVID-19 that we've had completely unexpected, and the longer term existential threats that come from things like climate change. And this does lead people to fear for the future. The speed of change really gets people. And as we said, one thing about uncertainty, it gets very difficult to plan ahead and you feel a sense of threat, loss of control. So this brings up questions about people's identities. You get polarized views. It doesn't take much for that to lead to people saying, oh, can we make things easier? We need some order here. Somebody please help us. And you end up very swiftly in an environment where people rather like the idea of dictatorship and autocracy as a way of making things more certain or trying to make things more certain. All this really plays out as a defensive type of mindset where what we're doing is building walls around us really to try and keep the world out, blocking information, not trying to listen, trying to hear nothing really or see what's going on, building that protective shield and then just going back to tried and trusted traditional behaviours, a defensive mindset, an attempt to protect ourselves from the new and the changing and what we don't understand, which is fine in its way, but doesn't always work and also misses the fact that uncertainty and the essential changes that take place also brings opportunities if we know how to take them, and really gives us the opportunity, in fact, to discard the things that have been holding us back and maybe we needed to change anyway, and provides us with an opportunity for creativity and for coming up and shaping a better world. And so looking at uncertainty from that perspective in a positive way is something we want to talk about today, proactive way. How can we use uncertainty to do that? To do that, let's think about some of the psychological strategies we can adopt for dealing with uncertainty. And we've talked about logical approaches in terms of different levels of complexity, but what about psychological approaches, things we can do as individuals which will help us cope? We need a model for that. And Terry and I talked about this for some time, trying to think what would be a good analogy. And one thing that struck us really was this story, came from my past actually, when I was living in Canada many years ago as an expatriate in an energy company. I had a great job and really enjoyed it. My hair then was about the same length as it turned out to be in the pandemic. but it was a really good time, and I enjoyed the work. But what I really enjoyed about Canada was the scale and size of the country, the fact that you could drive these enormous distances across the place, and you couldn't do that obviously in the UK. It was really great, and particularly driving across Highway 1 was the experience of a lifetime. You started off in Manitoba, all the way through Saskatchewan, and then Alberta, right through to British Columbia. And when you start this journey, you're on flat prairie land. It goes on straight lines, straight roads as far as the eye can see, beautiful yellow canola flowers, blue sky. It really doesn't change very much, and you can predict and plan ahead exactly where you're going to be with some certainty, because it just looks more or less the same. You know if you're here now where you're going to be in 3 or 4 hours time, given a certain speed, there's not much traffic, and the weather's more or less the same. But as you drive on, eventually things do start to change. You come to the Rocky Mountains, Alberta, and it's a fantastic sight, the sight of this sheer wall of rock coming out of the prairies, and the road starts to go up. There's more shadows, there's more clouds, the temperature changes. You can feel things are beginning to be a bit different. And then as you keep going, you eventually come to the Rockies, the mountains, and you're in a different world, a world which is a world where changes and uncertainty actually are everywhere. You've got, it's exciting, it's a bit more risky, there's ice and snow, you see mountains ahead of you which look different depending on which angle you look at them from. The weather can change unexpectedly. It's a lot less predictable. And so we thought of this, I thought of this and we talked about this, and we thought, well, this is a very good metaphor really for what uncertainty can be like. The straightforward, if you look up the left-hand side of this graph, this picture, we've got a continuous, the y-axis shows at the bottom quite straightforward, quite predictable situations. And at the top, very random, unexpected and chance situations, and a kind of continuous move from one to the other. And then you can see how that journey through from the plains to the Rockies is also a journey in uncertainty also, as we move from fairly stable LAMO times to a world where there are really challenges and shapes and changes and things which we don't know, a great deal more uncertainty, really ridges of uncertainty. We call those the Richmor range, where you have all these peaks. And we started to ask the question, when you come to, when you're driving along the flat, as it were, you just keep going and keep doing the same things. But when you get to a situation where you're in a mountainous terrain, or there's a lot of uncertainty in this model, what are the kind of strategies you can use for getting up and over one of those ridges? We thought maybe there's a number of strategies that you can use in order to take yourself over a ridge of uncertainty. Let's just give an overview of those to start with, and then we'll go to them in a bit more detail. The first one, pretty much the one that worked when times were stable, was just to keep on doing the same thing. In that environment, we continue to act in familiar ways, deny there's any need to change our approach. It's got a head in the sand attitude to some extent, but if the uncertainty doesn't last too long, doing nothing can be a perfectly sensible strategy. It's rather like walking around the side of a mountain, or and finding actually you don't have to go up and over the top, but you can just keep going. We might also want to go up, and the second strategy, disrupting, call this a time to change the goalpost. It's actually a strategy where we see the need for change and the need to challenge the status quo, and we're prepared to take the risk of increasing uncertainty in order to make things different, because we realize we just can't carry on in the same way as we did in the past. So disruption, increasing uncertainty, is actually a quite logical approach when we are faced with these periods of turbulence. we don't necessarily need to carry on in the same way as we did before. It's time to look at things from a different way. We could perhaps decide that it's best not to try and do too much, but at the same time, the uncertainty is so great, we need to keep an eye open for what's going on. Perhaps we acknowledge that things are changing. We acknowledge that things are changing, but realize that most of it is outside our control for now. So we concentrate in an accepting strategy on really looking at what we can control, which is ourselves, rather than looking at what we can't control, which is the world outside. So we accept things, we look at the way things are going, but we also keep an eye out for what might be happening. So that's a third approach. It works a lot when there's high levels of uncertainty. We might also think this uncertainty is too much to bear. We need to actually get it sorted and reduce the level of uncertainty the best we can, and just take control of the situation by putting in place usually our own view of what the future should be, and setting a fair amount of putting a fair amount of direction in place in order to make sure that things become easier to understand. So it's a kind of approach which can be used by people in positions of power very often, and often is, in order just to simplify things, in the same way that disrupting is used by people very often who don't have power and just want to change things. And lastly, we could actually take a logical, rational approach to this and say that what we really need to do is to develop a clearer understanding of what's going on to enable us to make decisions about what's happening. And that we would take an approach where we might question things in the first place, what are our assumptions, do a little bit of research, and then on the basis of understanding rather than force, if you like, actually try and put into place new ways of doing things and better ways of doing things. So that's the overview, ways of getting up and over that. Let's just look at each of them in a little more detail to get a feel of what they are. And let's start off with defensive, which you remember was keep doing the same thing. Sometimes doing nothing is a sensible strategy. Sometimes things will go away. Unfortunately, sometimes it can also lead to denial. And if you go on in a world of uncertainty, just keep going with your head in the sand and don't realize you run the risk of leaving it too late to do anything. And you know, you really ought to have been thinking about it before. So defensive strategy can be okay when you've got not too much change, or it doesn't go on too long, not too much uncertainty, but in an environment, particularly where there's exponential change taking place, it's very easy to leave things too late. Disrupting. This is a strategy where you decide it's time to change the goalposts. You can see some examples of disruptive strategies there, ranging from the flower power of the 60s through some Nelson Mandela, who was initially quite disruptive in what was happening to try and put rights on apartheid. I think in the top corner here, we have a picture of Terry here in Epsom, which is my hometown, where she was sitting next to a statue of a lady who threw herself in front of a horse in Epsom races, the Epsom Derby, and she was killed, unfortunately, but she's drawing attention to women's rights, and she's now become immortalized in that statue. And you see, you know, other events which are more obvious. It can either be responsible or irresponsible. Responsible disruption being when it's done with a bigger cause in mind and with concern for the consequences. Irresponsible where it's done more just for the benefit of the individual or the person, and not really with the bigger picture in mind. So we prefer to talk about responsible disruption as being something which is useful. And where is a responsible disruption? What does it look like? As we said, it tends to be aligned with ethics and values. It's good for the wider community. it's a situation where people see the consequences of their actions. So they may be disruptive, but they're not really causing harm. It's based on ethics. It respects others. It's open-minded in the sense that it's not just pushing a point of view without looking at evidence. And ultimately, you need to be held accountable. So disruption is important, but it's important that it's responsible rather than irresponsible, and sometimes quite difficult to really know exactly whether something is responsible or irresponsible. Are the actions of Extinction Rebellion responsible because they're for the wider good, or are they irresponsible because, for example, some of their actions can lead to roads being blocked and people eventually even dying as a consequence of not being able to get to where they need to get? It depends, of course. You need to think these cases through. So a disruption can come in those forms, but it's a very important strategy in terms of uncertainty, because it's available to everyone, really, regardless of power level. You can do something about it and get a sense of agency from it. Accepting strategies, particularly when times are tough and times are difficult and you don't really know what's going on. In uncertainty, it can be very important just to go with the flow and take stock. And we've seen an increase in interest in mindfulness, and really people thinking, how can they make sure that what they can control themselves is the first thing. It's the first thing. Under stressful circumstances, being able to look after yourself and think about your own self-control is very, very important. You see it even in sports. I'm not sure you can see that picture there. I'll take it down a second, but this was Emma Raducanu, who took stock, really, of the situation in the Wimbledon final when her knee was damaged, and kept her cool despite all sorts of things happening on the outside. Took the opportunity to reflect and think about, scan and think what the environment was going on in the environment and what she needed to do. So it can be a very successful strategy from that perspective. And also, I think we had an example. Yeah, it's an opportunity also with an accepting strategy to really, the uncertainty is at its most usually when you do this. So it's an opportunity to look and see what's coming, scan the environment, look outwards. We hear a lot now about the need to look outwards in times of uncertainty, look externally. And that's because sometimes you can see, by just taking attention just from yourself to looking outwards, you can actually get a good idea of what might be coming next and plan your response accordingly. So they're the first three strategies. Imposing strategy, which we've talked about a lot, which is one which people kind of like a lot sometimes because it just gets things sorted, or apparently does. There's some examples here of that. Take back control, get Brexit done was the classic example of something where people rather like the idea, whatever it meant. But of course, this is the issue with imposition of any kind, that you don't know. It's only available to those with real power, and it relies on the fact that you're actually correct in what you're trying to do, and your vision of the future is correct. Imposing strategies need to be used very carefully. Here's some of the questions we think that are important with imposition. I mean, are imposing strategies the best solution? Are they just a quick fix to make people feel better? Is it harmful? Pragmatically, will people do as they're told? What happens if they don't? Is it just simply an abuse of power? So imposing strategies, people kind of like them very often, but they're often really not extremely helpful. They certainly don't get people to think for themselves in a way which is helpful. They can be necessary, but when there's a social good and things need to be done quickly, but they can also be quite damaging and dangerous. And the last strategy, which we talk about, was exploring the rational scientific approach, and that's really quite I always think it's the gold standard of of strategies when it comes to uncertainty, because what it does is it takes time, investment, it takes maturity, because people have got to be prepared to wait for a while until the results become clear. But if you understand an issue and understand a problem properly, then of course, once you've understood it, it's very easy to put into place solutions, and much easier. And that's been the way scientific research has worked over the years. And it's the way psychology very often moves forward as well, by really looking at the evidence. So it is the gold standard. It's proved very successful over the years, but would say that it's rarely enough on its own in times of uncertainty. And there's a number of reasons for that. As they say in investments, the past is not always a guide to the future, but it also takes time and resources to collect data. Maybe also that the future is just too complex to predict, and any action you may take might be just too late. So although the exploring strategy is the gold standard, in practice, really going to have to look at a way of bringing all these strategies to bear when you have peak uncertainty, as we have nowadays very often. How can you use all these strategies in a simple way to navigate through these sort of times? So
going backwards.
Take you from there to an approach which brings all these things together. Terry, I think I'm just going to take the first part of this, am I?
Yes, Richard.
Okay, so this is the Richmor model we put together, which actually brings together all these basic strategies in a very simple framework, which we can use to help us deal with situations of uncertainty. So if we go back to the original picture that we had, then we showed how uncertainty can be characterized by going from very straightforward to very unexpected situations on a continuum, and that when you're going through the planes, as it were, and times when you're working through periods of certainty, it's quite easy to plan ahead. It's much more difficult in times of uncertainty to plan and to understand exactly what's going to happen next. So, sorry, I'm just going through this again. So in navigating through uncertain times, we would say that when you're driving through the plains, or when you're going through that kind of period, you can use methods for navigation which are really based on simple planning, linear planning. You can look forward, you can plan ahead, you can guess what's coming next, you can try it out, do it, you can check that you're more or less on target, and you can adjust what you want to do. So if you're, the analogy of driving across the plains, if you want to work out where you're going for dinner that evening, you can say, well, it's 300 kilometers, I'm going to do 80 kilometers an hour. That's 300 divided by 80, whatever that is, just less than 4 hours. I can work out exactly where I'm going to be. I'll check my speed after I've gone a little way. We know the weather's not going to change. So we can use a classic Deming PDCA cycle to work out where we are. But how do we navigate, and what do we do when we come to the mountains, where we kind of work out where we're going to go and how we're going to go, but we don't really know how the weather's going to change, or how conditions will change, or whether we're going to be able to, what we're going to be able to do, whether it's even right to set off. What's the approach we need then? And for that, we probably need a different approach, or we need a different approach, and that's what we call the Richmor cycle. So Terry, I'm going to go over to you now to describe that in more detail.
Thank you, Richard. If you could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the model, as Richard said, is called the Richmor Model, and it's come from an amalgamation of our two names, nothing very exotic, Richard and Morrissey, so Richmor. And basically it takes 4 steps. And so I'd like to go through each of those in turn. So the first one is to take the time to think. So rather than just go straight into acting, we believe it's really important to, and a lot of people, we don't spend enough time doing this, is to carve out the time to reflect and take time to think, where am I? what do I need to do? What is this situation I'm in? So spend a bit of time just thinking about, before you do anything at all, take time out to reflect. The second is then to think strategically. And again, in the next step would be to think about what, I suppose one of the key things to ask ourselves is, what is the meaning of what we're trying to do? What's the purpose of what we're trying to achieve? It's always good to check out a couple of scenarios and options. One thing we find very helpful, I know some people are critical of this approach, but we actually do feel it's very important to paint pictures for people of how things might be in the future. So paint out a number of narratives, a number of stories as to, you know, what would be, you know, different possible alternative futures when you're thinking strategically, and to present those in as graphic a way as you can to get people to reflect and to think about, again, what their options might be. The third step is then to test and to explore. And so using our exploring strategy and experimentation to try out something and see how it works, and to take the time to do that. And the final step then is to act. And I think, you know, maybe some of us can, you know, are okay up to the point where we've looked at various options. But once we've picked an option, we find quite often we stall and we tend not to move forward and take the action. Like, how many times have you developed a strategy, but you've never actually seen it implemented? I'm thinking of the Paris Agreement, which is, you know, a recent, in terms of climate change. We have COP26 in a minute. And I bet you when we go back and we look at what was planned or in COP26, the actions didn't follow the planning. And this is where a lot of us stop. We stop short of actually putting into practice the things that we think that should be done for all sorts of reasons, including not having the courage to act when we need to act. Let's take each one of these steps in turn. Now, carving out the time to think. We do a demonstration. We're not going to do it here, but we have an exercise that we do where we ask people to think of their priorities. What are the, and when you're reflecting and you're taking time out to think, what are your priorities in terms of what you want to achieve, either in the course of action or in your life in general? And these are the golf balls you see there, and the other paraphernalia pieces that you can add into your thinking is the kidney beans or sand or water, which we do in the demonstration. But let's just take the golf balls and the kidney beans. When you're clear about what your priorities are and you actually operate on those first, you see something like the picture on the left-hand side, which is that in terms of, you know, making the time to think, you can actually, you know, if you start with your priorities, you can get your priorities achieved, as well as the kidney beans, which are all the duties and responsibilities and things that you have to do every day. And then when you go to if you don't actually start with your priorities and the things that are most important, you may fill up your time with all the duties and responsibilities and the activities that you do every day, but your priorities take second place. So you don't actually get your priorities achieved. So when you have time to think and reflect on, well, what are my key priorities in relation to anything I need to do, and make the time then to actually put those in the jar first. So that exercise gets people to think about what they're spending their time on. I think then the next step is to strategize. And that is to say, well, what is it? Have we got a shared vision and a sense of purpose in what we're actually doing? And we're reminded of a story that is told about a couple of bricklayers who are working, and an interviewer goes up to the first one and says, what are you doing here? And she says, I'm just laying bricks. I'm putting one brick on top of the other, and I'm just laying bricks. They ask a second person, what are you doing here? and they say, I'm actually building a wall. So I'm having a bigger purpose than just doing, putting the bricks together. I'm actually building a wall. So I've got a sense of a goal. And then the third person, they say, what are you doing here? And they say, I'm building a cathedral. And that gives a sense of purpose and meaning and achievement to the activities that we're engaged in. So, thinking strategically is thinking about what's our bigger purpose? What are we ultimately trying to achieve here? Are we just laying bricks, or are we contributing to a wider, bigger purpose, of which we can see our role in the bricklaying, but that is actually building a much bigger outcome than just laying bricks. In the third step, we talked about exploring, and quite often we learn as we go, but this is something from a book by Adam Kahan, which is, I think, quite interesting in the context of this conference. It's called Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People You Don't Agree with, Like, or Trust. And he has a number of propositions around how we can actually work with people that we may consider our enemies. But part of his process is about how you actually learn as you go from where you started you intended to go to what happens when you actually go along that path of learning. And exploring your way through that is, you may have intended to go somewhere, but on the journey, you find that there are things that you pick up on the way. So you're feeling your way, you're looking for evidence. You may experiment with particular options and discard them as you go. So you take out of your planning the things that you can never realize, or the things that don't work, and new things come in. They emerge as you're going through this. You find that you're finding out new information, so that you're bringing that in to your path as you're actually exploring, and you're trying success. And you're building support and building coalitions and building allies as you go through this journey of exploration and finding out how you need to do things as you go through. So that would be your third step, is about exploring and experimenting, looking for things that work, discarding things that don't work, and sticking with the things that you do find work, and then building up a plan. And then you come to your preferred option. Now, it's at this point, this is where it's really important that you take decisive action and you act. When you have worked through the other steps, that you've gone through the process and you've picked an option, and this is the one you're going to go for. And this is where you need the courage to move forward and to take a bold step. You've thought about, is the time right? Do I have a plan? One of the people that you may have heard of is Ernest Shackleton, who actually was an Irishman, an explorer, who took an exploration down to the Antarctic. And at a particular point, when his ship was stuck on the ice, he had to make a very bold decision, which was to abandon ship. They left the ship behind, and they only took with them exactly what they needed. And those who were undecisive, or weren't sure, he said, you're either with me or you're not with me, but this is our decision, we're going. And he's thought through the consequences. He gathered his allies, and he had the courage to implement his action, which was to leave the ship behind and go forward on foot. Now, in the same way that we are thinking about making decisions in uncertainty, when we've actually decided the option we want to take, it's really, really important that we follow through. And even though it may be foggy and there may be not much guiding light, we've gone through our thinking process, and we've come to the conclusion that this is our best option. And then we actually need to decide actively and decisively. And this requires courage. And we talked about Nelson Mandela earlier on. We'll come to him in a minute, but there was somebody who had the courage to act. It doesn't mean you feel fear. He said, just because I'm taking a courageous decision doesn't mean I feel afraid. You do feel fear, but you do it anyway, as I think the title of the book is, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. you actually take the decision and you work your way through the consequences, and you take responsibility for your actions, which is really, really critical. Some competencies, we just want to say a few words about the kinds of skills and competencies that we think are important in a time of uncertainty. Now, we've taken this, borrowed this from Irish folklore, the shamrock. Those of you who may be familiar with Ireland will know that the shamrock is one of our national emblems, and it's on a lot of Irish artifacts and buildings, and it's not on the flag, but it's certainly understood to be a symbol. But we've taken it to describe the core competencies that we feel are important at a time of uncertainty. The first one is, again, thinking the big picture, being able to see the big picture. Don't narrow your vision before you've had a chance to look around, and think big, think systems, and think large. And this is why critical thinking is important. If you start to funnel yourself down early on, you exclude all the possibilities and the options. You need to stay big thinking and keep your critical faculties alive. So that's the first one. The second one then is really important, and we talk about collaboration quite a lot in uncertainty. You can't do it by yourself, and not one discipline has all the answers. As we have found, psychology doesn't have the answers to everything. It has a part to play with many other disciplines, including things like economics, behavioral economics, sociology, anthropology, scientific subjects, chemistry, biochemistry, and so on. All of these are important, but working with people then becomes important. So collaboration and teamwork, being able to network, having an emotional intelligence, empathy, and influencing and persuasion become very important. If people are coming with different views and perspectives, it's really important that we use our skills of influencing, of bringing people with us rather than cutting them out or getting into conflict. And this is these skills are quite highly complex. Managing myself. One of the things that's really important in uncertainty is taking responsibility for myself, for my actions. Obviously being aware of other people, but also being accountable, having the courage of your convictions and your principles. We think it's important that you don't lose your sense of humor, and having an open mindset, which we'll talk about in a minute, having the resilience to keep going. And finally, bringing that all together in the STEM is this core. My character and my purpose, my principles and my values become critically important in managing myself and managing others through an uncertain time. So taking all this together, we see Nelson Mandela as a good example of this person who was able to bring all of these together in himself. His strategy that he had for dealing with apartheid, he actually brought in the process of reconciliation and talking to his enemies. When he was in Robben Island, I've been there myself, it's quite a moving experience. He actually became friends of his captors became friends of his through the strength of his personality and his skills and his ability to bring people with him. And it's these kind of characteristics, okay, we're not saying we're all going to be Nelson Mandela's, but striving to actually try and bring these competencies to life in the work that we do, in any kind of change that we're trying to bring about, any kind of social action that we're involved in, remembering our strategies, remembering the competencies, bringing all these together to see how can we actually navigate our way through uncertainty in also talking about issues of justice and equality. So Richard, if you'd like to give some reflections before we bring our talk to a conclusion.
Okay, Terry. Yeah, just move ahead. Yeah, some of the implications, just bringing that to some of the things that we've said here in the broad sense. We really like this quote. We called our book Uncertainty Rules with a question mark, because we believe that the spirit of inquiry the need to remain open-minded are absolutely, the need to be a little uncertain are the qualities, and the need for some humility are the things you need in these times if you're going to be successful. We believe a number of things, though. We don't think you can deal with uncertainty by trying to eradicate it. Uncertainty arises as a consequence of complexity and complex systems, and we can choose to some extent. We have to manage our response to that, but we can't just wish it away. It's a feature of the world. Sometimes we don't know how things are going to turn out. We can try and imagine that we could make it something that it's not, but we have to go with the flow to some extent. We have to accept the fact we don't always know the answers, and attempts to try and turn to someone who might have the answer when there just isn't one are not attempts which are going to lead to a great deal of success in the long run. We've also learned there's rarely simple, quick fixes to complex problems. It's very nice to have a soundbite, which seems to make people feel good. The classic was take back control in Brexit, but it's not always as easy as that, and they're really quick fixes. It usually takes time, it usually takes dialogue, and looking at very many different perspectives to try and sort out exactly what underpins a problem and what we can do about it. As we said at the top, the certainty we are right is what leads to coercion, abuse of power, and fascism. So having an ethical base and a sense of values is really important if we're going to use uncertainty in as a positive force for change. We think that respect, consideration, listening, and collaboration generally lead to the best outcomes. You can see that with the vaccine rollout, actually, not the vaccine rollout, the search for vaccines, in the sense that there was clearly a great deal of collaborative working that went on, and people really shared ideas, and that led to some very fast changes and very fast solutions being found. As Terry said, the courage to act, to try things out and learn from experience is essential. One thing we think is that blaming other people and society for our ills can be a waste of energy. It rarely really seems to achieve that much, and very often to have the locus of control within ourselves is the best way forward, and trying to look at what we can change in ourselves as a starting point, and how we can affect the immediate environment around us is, and how we can take responsibility for that seems to be more successful. Blaming others is a quick way out of these sorts of problems, but it really is a bit of a waste of energy. And we think a proactive approach is demanding, but better than burying your head in the sand. So there's some of the things that we've reflected on, and we've reflected on the fact that, I guess, rather than a defensive mindset where we build walls around ourselves and try and keep things out, we need to start from inside ourselves. What's our core purpose? Why are we doing what we're doing? And what are we really trying to achieve? And how do we want to do that? What's our purpose in life? Start from there. And then go outwards, looking at new information, not blocking it all out, but looking at all, not looking at everything, but trying to actually, trying to really shape what's going on and being flexible in the approach that we take. So those things really seem to be very key, and are much more likely to be successful in an uncertain environment than just trying to shut everything out and block everything in. Recognizing sometimes you have to increase uncertainty a bit in order to, when I say increase uncertainty, you have to ask questions, which does increase uncertainty in order to be able to eventually come up with the right answer. So there's a few thoughts, and Terry, I could perhaps take over?
Yes, I just like to finish with just a few thoughts that we feel are useful, and also a couple of questions at the end that might inform any discussion we have afterwards. So, Richard, if we could carry on, please. One of the things I think is very clear from listening to us today is that we feel very strongly that we need to take responsibility for ourselves, for what we do, for our actions, for the consequences of our actions and their impact on others. So we take personal responsibility, and that's a value that we live very much by ourselves. We have a clear sense of purpose and values, and we know what we stand for, that we're not hopping around the place like flotsam and jetsam on a sea, on a wave of uncertainty, that we, the thing that anchors us in any kind of situation is our own sense of our values and our purpose. We can control the controllable, you can't control the uncontrollable. And we can certainly control ourselves and our responses to situations. And that gives us a certain amount of power. Viktor Frankl said, I have 6 million reasons. And he's 6 million reasons for surviving when he was in the most awful situation. And this is what you can control. You can control how you respond to your situation. Sometimes creating a routine can help. Now that could be, I know during lockdown, we couldn't work with our colleagues. Sometimes having a routine of checking in every day. I know that's something that a lot of people did because they could do it on Zoom. We'd have a call and 9 o'clock every morning for half an hour, check in how we are, make sure we create a routine in this uncertain world. Other routines can also help, but we're not saying that your whole life should be a routine, because then you're actually denying uncertainty. You have to be open to it, but create a certain amount of routine and have it. Simplify things where possible, and keep a sense of perspective and humor. I think even in the most terrible situations, you can find something that you can have a laugh at. Quite often we forget that humor actually can help us through all sorts of dark situations, and keeping a positive mindset and staying connected to people. And really don't underestimate the power of enduring relationships with people you trust. I think the whole point of relationship building and building trust is what actually can help us move forward with the courage to act in an uncertain environment. I'd just like to leave you with a few thoughts, let's think about some broader questions that you might want to think about in our discussion. To what extent do you think our societies, institutions, and organizations support, encourage, and educate people to take a proactive approach to uncertainty? Now, we feel certain institutions and certain societies damp down uncertainty, and we see a lot of autocratic cultures emerging more recently. Is a way of dealing with uncertainty. Is this the right approach? We don't think so, but you might have different views. Taking an autocratic, dictatorial approach is certainly not the way forward. To what extent do our political leaders act as role models and ambassadors in this whole area? Where do we see things like courage, respect, empathy, and so on, freedom and truth? What do these words mean anyway to people? And do we see, when we look around, do we see leadership that exemplifies these kind of values, which are important values in a time of uncertainty? And are people encouraged to develop these kinds of values and characteristics? What about our work organizations where we work? Do you have a sense of ownership and personal responsibility? Do you feel empowered and engaged? Do you have a sense of agency over what you do? And finally, do our educational systems do enough to prepare people for uncertainty? I mean, we believe uncertainty is a fact of life. brushing it under the carpet is brushing it under the carpet. It will come out somehow, eventually. You know, it leaks out, a system leaks out its uncertainties over time. And you can't keep it trapped down indefinitely. This is our view. You may disagree with us, but when we're looking at issues of, you know, political systems, of justice, of equality, we think that, you know, within these systems, there's a lot of uncertainty, but within that, we can actually create values and models of behavior and activity and action that can take us through even the most uncertain of times. So with that, we'd like to thank you, and you can find our book and you can listen to our music, and you can contact us, and we look forward to the discussion that follows.
Okay.
Thank you.